Hello everyone, it's Mark. I am your host here at The First Chapter. Today we are going to be reading the first 3 chapters of Target by Darci Cole. Darci is a friend of mine and a fellow beta reader for Brandon Sanderson, and Target is her debut novel, and it is published through Ember Rose Entertainment, and so I'm going to be reading from this book today. If you would like to go ahead and skip straight to the reading, go ahead and go to the timestamp on screen now. Otherwise, I am going to read the jacket blurb for this book. The fairy tales never mentioned this. Pressured to choose a bride before his 18th birthday, Prince Lex is determined to do things the way he's read about in legends. Run away to find his true love. But soon he is at the mercy of a band of outlaws who know more about his kingdom than he does. Traveling with them, he is forced to face the reality and naivety of his privileged palace life. His people suffer at the hands of greedy nobility, and they look not to Lex's parents for help, but to this band of outlaws led by a girl named Robin. Their problems grow worse when they discover a plot to assassinate Lex's parents. But while they race to save the kingdom, Lex's heart begins to race for Robin, and the more time he spends with her, the closer he gets to falling. But when she finally shares her story, Lex finds himself wanting something he's never wanted before: revenge. The front of the book has 2 very nice maps here of the Unbroken Lands and the Kingdom of Regania. I apologize if I'm butchering any of the names in here. I did not ask for a pronunciation guide. I probably should do that in the future, but I'm going to do my best today, and I offer my apologies for anything I pronounce incorrectly. Part 1. The Meeting. Epigraph. I forgot to write again. We heard of a conflict in which a shipment of wool blankets was being fought over, and I was distracted. Chapter 1. Lex. His Royal Highness, Prince Alexander Galani of Rhaenia, twisted the ring on the first finger of his left hand, trying to ignore the itching of his scars over his eye and shoulder. His anxiety was piqued, and he knew what was coming. "Are you all right?" Enzi, his servant, asked beside him. Lex sighed, keeping his gaze forward, ignoring the tapestries and guards and the view of the city through open windows. "No," he said. I mean, yes, I'll be fine." He could almost hear the raise of Enzi's brow. As Lex's personal servant, Enzi would never directly defy him, but that didn't stop him from reacting. "You know as well as I do what they're going to say," Lex said, keeping his voice low. "They've probably already chosen a wife for me." "Probably," Enzi said. "This is mucking stupid." He reached up to rub at the skin beneath the eye patch over his left eye. "Want some balm?" Enzi said, pulling a tin from his pocket. Lex sighed, pausing in the corridor, and took some, rubbing it onto the agitated skin. Flanked by 2 guards, the doors to his parents' study stood 20 feet away now, and it was likely his entire future was already decided for him. He hated it. "Prince Lex," Enzi said, "can I ask you something?" Lex straightened his robes, taking a moment. "Sure. What is it?" Enzi looked at the floor. "Do you even want to be married?" "Of course," Lex said, handing back the balm. "I've always wanted to. I knew I'd need to when the time came, but it has to be the right person, doesn't it?" "Then why don't you like any of them?" Lex blinked. "Them?" "The ladies of the court," Enzi said. Lex paused. "I mean," Enzi grinned, "I know you're not attracted to men, otherwise you'd obviously be with me." "Obviously," Lex said, returning the smile. "So what is it?" Lex pulled Enzi away from the doors, out of earshot of the guards, then paused. "They look at me different, in this," he said, pointing to his face. "You, my parents, my close friends, none of you flinch when I take off the eye patch. You know me. You don't stare. You don't think differently." "But," Enzi said, "isn't that something that'll come with time?" I've known most of these girls since I was 10, Lex said. I've been to balls, festivals, feasts with them. I've spoken to them, played games with them, written letters to them, and yet not a single one can look me in the face without a slight cringe in their expression. Enzi frowned. Maybe, Lex sighed again. Maybe I'm imagining it, maybe it's all in my head, but I can't bring myself to marry a girl who I'm not absolutely sure has accepted me, scars and all. But, Enzi started, but where will you... Lex gave a quick shake of his head, eyeing the guards nearby. Enzi swallowed. Do you have a plan? The coast, Lex said softly. The Midsummer Festival is happening in a week. Maybe I can meet people, make friends, and if I'm lucky... He trailed off. I have to do this, especially if my parents are about to tell me what I think they are, and I can't do it without your help. Can I count on you? Enzi sighed and gave a short bow. Yes, my Lord Prince. Thank you. Lex squared his shoulders, turning toward the study. As he approached, the guards reached out and opened the doors, revealing a simple room with a long rug down the middle, shelves lining the walls, and a fire lit in the far hearth. Lex stopped halfway across the room to avoid the heat, facing two soft chairs where his parents sat waiting, a third empty chair across from them. The doors behind him closed, but he knew Enzi would be inside, watching. 3 more servants stood at the far wall, awaiting their monarch's needs. Alexander, Lex's mother said, standing to take his hands in hers. Thank you for coming. I know you've been busy lately overseeing the canal expansion. It's nothing that can't wait, Lex said, placing a kiss on her cheek. Larissa Golani was tall, golden-haired, and lovely, even in her 50th year, the model of a Reganian woman. The scent of flowery perfume wafted off of her, taking him back to when she'd placed her hands so carefully around him after his accident, when the cures hadn't worked fast enough and he was left with scars, despite magic, avoiding the injuries, helping him fall asleep when the pain became too much. She reached up and brushed her hair back. I don't know why all you boys insist on keeping your hair so long in the front. I want to see your handsome face. Lex laughed, then turned to his father, Stefan Galani, a tall, fit man who studied, who worshipped the god Celeo over the rest, favoring stability, keeping things running, steady and sure. The edges of the king's hair were graying, but his smile was as young and bright as it had ever been. The king placed a hand on Lex's shoulder. I heard you're doing well in writing lessons. So they tell me, Lex said. I've got a good mare. Feels like we'll get along. I'm glad you're taking up writing again. Maybe we can go together soon, down to Belicia, or maybe the mountains. I'd like that. How's sparring? Father asked. Going well. Master Lin says I'm improving each day. Excellent, excellent, Father said. We're very proud of you. Lex, Mother said. She took her seat once more and gestured for Lex to take the chair across from them. What about the meeting with Lady Irina, Oliver's cousin? She asked. Such a sweet girl, isn't she? Now they were getting to it. Of course, she's very kind, Lex said. But... Lex sighed. It's like I've told you before. I spent time with every eligible young woman in the court, and it's always the same. Son, Father started. You don't know what it's like, Lex said, standing again and stepping away. People look at you and they see perfection. A model marriage, the ideal king and queen. They look at me and... He ran a hand through his hair, tugging a bit, letting the pain there distract him from the stretching of his scars. Surely if they were to spend more time with you, Mother began. Maybe, Lex said, but how long? I've spent at least a few hours with each one in the past 6 months, since you both have been pushing this so strongly, and more with many of them, especially those I've known since childhood. None of them can even look me in the eye. He turned to see the two of them exchanging a sad look. Not pity. His parents would never pity him, but something close to heartbreak. Should he tell them? ask. Lex, Mother said, standing, what we want most is for you to be happy. But you're a prince, and with that comes responsibility. I know that, but... He paused, took a breath. Let me look outside the nobility. What? Father said. Just as an experiment, Lex said. I hardly spend time around the common folk. Maybe I could find someone. Son, the king said, cutting him off. You've been eligible to marry for nearly 2 years. There are many lovely young ladies. No, you're not listening to me. None of them. We hoped things would happen naturally, of course, Father said, turning toward the fireplace. It was so simple for us, we didn't worry about you. However, you turn 18 in 1 month's time, and you have not yet chosen a wife. Lex pressed his teeth together. Here it comes, he thought. We've been discussing the possible options, Mother said, and we truly believe Karina Valio is a wonderful choice. Father paused near the fire. Unless you choose a different young lady yourself, you will meet with Lady Karina and accept the proposal she's offered in 2 days. Lex's jaw dropped. 2 days? Yes, Mother said, 2 days. You've known these ladies for a long time, and that is plenty of time to choose who will be best to have at your side. Mother, Lex said, I don't love any of them. There are only a handful who can barely tolerate me. Why would you force me in this choice? You will choose a bride, Father said firmly, in 2 days, or you will agree to marry Karina Valio. Why the deadline? Lex asked. He'd argued this line before, but they'd never answered the question to his satisfaction. My birthday isn't for another month, and for that matter, why does it have to be by my birthday? And why can't it be someone outside the nobility? Father turned, his eyes narrowed. We have talked about this. Not enough, Lex snapped. You said it's tradition to do things that way, but the tradition obviously hasn't worked for me. Alexander, Mother said, do not shout. Why not? Lex said. You haven't listened to anything I say on this matter. You trust me with renovations and overseeing the guards, but this one thing that will affect the rest of my life, enough! Lex clamped his mouth shut. King Stefan stepped softly, but his shoulders were stiff. You will do as we say. Or what? Lex said. His mother gasped. Lex found it difficult to care. He was beyond arguing with them. What they had asked him to do was not worth the sacrifice of being with someone he didn't love. To your rooms, Mother said finally, breaking the silence, until you agree, or in 2 days' time. What? We won't accept the proposal for you, Alexander, Mother said, but you must understand this is important. We're getting old. We want to see you situated for success with a good woman as your future queen, and an heir of your own. Lex opened his mouth to argue, but his father cut him off. This is not up for debate, son. This is how things are done. Lex said nothing. Frustration building in his chest, he turned on his heel and left the room. It was time for drastic measures. Epigraph. I'm certain I sent a note to give half to each, but the towns claimed they both needed the entire lot, despite my instructions. Chapter 2. Lex. Lex woke himself moments before midnight, as he'd planned. Having an internal clock was a gift he'd never take for granted. Sitting up in bed, he reached for his eye patch, craning his ear toward the door. Boy's mad, I tell you, one of the guards said. I swear, shuffling. You can't say that about the prince. You're going to get us executed. He's got his pick from the finest ladies in the kingdom, and he doesn't want any of them? I don't care if he is the prince. You can't convince me he's not a mucking fool. Maybe I am a fool, Lex thought, adjusting the strap around his head, while the other guard swore under his breath. But I won't be a fool who sits around and does nothing. House arrest. Because of course there was no way he could escape from the palace he'd been living in for nearly 18 years. Bad prince. Go to your room until you get engaged. Ridiculous. He'd have thought his parents would know better. He was a prince. He knew his obligation was to marry and produce an heir. Take care of the kingdom, ensure its continued prosperity. Seeing his parents' love for each other had always made him look forward to marriage. He would do it, and do it gladly. But when all of his prospective brides flinched at the sight of him, carefully, slowly, Lex slipped out of his bed, feet meeting the cool marble floor. Through the open columns that made up one side of his room, bugs chirped their nightly calls to one another, and the wind sent a chill over Lex's skin. The room itself was large and airy. Paintings and sculptures lined the walls between his personal belongings, mostly books, which were haphazardly organized. The door being guarded was heavy dark wood and locked from the outside, but he wouldn't be going that way anyway. Lex knelt beside his bed and retrieved a length of rope Enzi had hidden there. Still straining to listen to the guards, Lex quietly tied the rope to one of the thick columns. That done, he went to his wardrobe and began to dress. Sturdy wool wrap, a soft leather tunic to protect him from the humidity, belt, and oilskin trousers. He shifted awkwardly in the trousers. He'd worn them before, but they always itched at his legs. Formal attire in the palace was a simple sleeveless robe, a chiton, gathered at the shoulders and belted at the waist. But he couldn't ride his horse wearing a chiton. That would not turn out well. Sandaled footsteps approached outside the door. Lex paused. "About time, boys," one of the guards said. Nicholas Bellici, one of Lex's two friends, laughed. "Apologies, sir. This one had a stomachache and needed some attention. You all right now?" "I'm fine, sir," said Oliver Arena, sounding a bit annoyed. The guard grunted. "Just don't let him through these doors, understand?" "Yes, sir," they said together. The two older guards' footsteps retreated, echoing in the polished stone corridor. A moment later, 3 tiny knocks sounded. The lock scraped, the door opening silently in the moonlight. "Lex?" Oliver called. "Here," Lex said, padding over to them, his feet still bare. "Thank you." "Your parents will know we helped," Nick said. "Maybe," Lex nodded. "But I doubt they'll punish you for it. Just follow the plan. You don't know where I'm going." "You're crazy," Oliver said. "You do know that, right?" Lex smiled. The fact that they weren't trying to stop him meant more than they'd ever know. "I'll be fine." Nick looked down the hallway before turning back. "You are sure about this, then?" "Yes," Lex said. "You know this isn't a whim." "Right," Nick said. Lex watched them, noticing attention to their expressions he hadn't before. "What is it?" Oliver sighed. "We're worried." "What? Why?" "Lex," Nick said, "you've hardly been outside the palace grounds your entire life." "That's not true," Lex snapped. "I spent weeks running around the orchards with you as a kid." "What he means," Oliver said, "is that you've never traveled on your own. Never had to sleep on the ground at night." "Look," Lex held up his hands, "I'll only be gone a few weeks, and then I'll come back. It'll be like it never happened." Nick and Oliver exchanged a look. Lex gritted his teeth. He had to do this now, or he'd never get another chance. "Anyway, thank you. Close the door and—" "Wait," Oliver said. "Here." He reached into a pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, opening it to reveal a single gold coin with a hole punched through it, glowing with a soft blue light. He offered it to Lex. "Is that—" "My father's," Oliver said. "He had it filled this morning. No one's touched it since." "Take it." An ache growing in his chest, Lex pulled a gold chain out from the pocket of his tunic. 2 rings swung there, his grandmother's wedding ring and the prince's seal. Carefully, Oliver helped him wind the chain through the coin. If he touched it, life magic would flow into him and grant him strength. It wouldn't fix his old injuries. Those had closed off. Healed years ago within weeks of the accident, he remembered the pain, the endless heat that raged through him, and the life vessels, cures, sitting by his bedside day after day, one hand in a barrel of water, the other on his body, trying to heal his injuries before they had a chance to close naturally. But Lex had been near death, and even the master cure, his parents' personal priest, could barely channel enough life to keep him breathing through the burns. Ever since, the things he thought he'd excel at had changed. The heavy scars that lined his left shoulder, neck, and side of his face were permanent in more ways than magic could help, the least of which was his habit of bumping into things on his left side because he couldn't see that way, or being able to raise his left arm higher than his chin. He'd gone from a bright 9-year-old who spent his time sparring to a bright 9-year-old who spent more time in the library than he needed to. He'd come to accept it, or at least he told himself he did. He stared at this coin now, wondering. He shook his head, pushing aside the memories. The magic wouldn't heal him, but it would make the scarred muscles less sore, grant him more endurance. This small vessel wasn't much, but at least it should help him get out of the capital. He slipped the chain around his neck and met Oliver's eyes. "Thank you. It's the least I can do." "Lex," Nick said, "be careful." Lex looked over Nick's blue eyes, olive skin, and golden hair, so like his own that people often asked if they were brothers. Oliver's paleness and dark hair, inherited from his Ignatian mother, made him stand out. He would miss them. Lex forced a laugh. "Why does this feel like a goodbye? I'll be back, I promise." The other two put their fists forward, and Lex did the same, meeting in the middle. "Use it well," he said. "Use it well," they repeated. He nodded his thanks and closed the door. The lock clicked back into place. His determination renewed, Lex hurried to wrap his feet in oilskin and put on his sandals, a thick-soled variety that would hold up in the rivers and mossy forests of the Reganian wild. He latched a dark cloak around his shoulders and pulled the hood up, then took up a small pack filled with extra clothing, his writing notebook and pencil, a small kit of healing supplies, and a couple of daggers. Then he went to the half wall. Wind pulled at his hair, and the distance from where he stood to the ground looked farther than he remembered. He shook his head, then pulled the gold chain from his collar and stared at the coin. "No turning back after this," he whispered. He put the coin between his teeth, letting his lips close around it. Energy flowed through him, and the soreness in his shoulder and neck was gone. The itching behind his lost eye that he barely noticed anymore was relieved. He breathed in, revitalized. The air was like a river flowing through his blood, granting him power. He had to move quickly. Letting himself over the edge, he gripped the rope and descended, hand over hand, the 40 feet to the ground. He passed one other window, like his own, where servants lay sleeping. The light helped him keep silent, and not a soul woke. "So far it's working," he thought. The servants would be the ones to raise the alarm in the morning, and by then, Nick and Oliver would be off duty and hopefully not suspected. He spat the coin from his teeth and felt the weight of his injuries hit him like a battering ram. Stumbling, he caught himself on the palace wall, swearing. He should have thought of this. He was used to having life magic heal minor injuries, but he'd never used it for added strength before. Muck! That hurt! When he finally caught his breath, he stared down at the coin. If this happened whenever he used it, he needed to be more careful. The palace sat on a raised hill, above the banks of the river Tardus, which served as a moat. The river was 30 feet across and 10 deep, and ran through the capital, Galanus, named for Lex's family. Lex made his way down to the river, to a granite walkway that followed the shore. Trees and shrubbery lined the walk, easily used as cover to avoid being seen by patrolling guards. A few hundred feet along the river, he came to the first canal that brought water through the rest of the city. Deep grooves in the ground, human-made rivers, flowing between homes and businesses, then out into the surrounding fields to water crops and groves. Not that nature needed much help. Regania was riddled with rivers. He turned at the fourth canal from where he began. This would lead him straight to the southern wall. He made his way slowly, carefully, his scars and pains feeling brand new. He was tempted to use the coin again, but pushed the thought away, forcing himself to focus on his surroundings. The canals, like the one he ran beside, were more for convenience than anything else. Running water and indoor plumbing helped the people stay healthy and happy. It was a luxury Regania invented that other countries had yet to copy. As he continued, Lex couldn't help smiling, knowing his kingdom was so well off. Part of him worried that there might be negative consequences from his leaving tonight, but seeing the comfort and prosperity of Galanus from up close like this, he was reassured. The kingdom would be fine without him for a while. Sticking to the shadows helped him stay unseen, and within minutes he'd made his way through the entire city. Another rope waited for him at the outer wall, hanging from 30 feet up. Lex took a breath. He'd never make it with his bad shoulder. Not without the coin. His jaw clenched. Then he bit down on the gold once more. Climbing was as easy as lowering had been. At the top, Enzi waited. "You're late," Enzi said, hurrying to move the rope to the outer side of the wall. "Blame Nick and Oliver," Lex said, still holding the coin in his mouth. "We have 7 minutes," Enzi said. "Your horse, sword, and extra supplies are there in the trees, near those boulders. You have to get down the other side and into the shadows before the guards come by." Lex began to climb over the edge. "Will you get away safe?" he asked, his words muffled through the coin between his teeth. "I'll be fine," Enzi said. "You, get out of here." Lex sighed, grateful for his friendship. "They'll throw you in the dungeon." "Maybe," Enzi shrugged. "So long as Andre sneaks down to visit, I'll be happy." Lex laughed. "You be safe," Enzi said, turning serious. "I will," Lex said. "Thank you." Hand under hand, Lex lowered himself to the ground once more. He ran for the trees the moment his feet hit soil, and was in their shadows in a matter of moments. He looked back then to see Enzi pulling the rope back up and carrying it away. In the distance, guards made their way toward the now empty spot. He'd done it. He was out, and it would be hours before anyone realized he was gone. A thrill filled his chest. The thought of the midsummer festival on the coast, filled with food and colors and normal people. Surely he would meet someone. Surely. A few yards into the trees, Lex's horse was picketed. Pepper, a dappled gray mare, shook her black-maned head at him as he approached. Lex braced himself, then spat out the coin and collapsed against her neck. He wasn't a weak person. He could lift a sword and hold his own in a fight. But he'd become so used to dealing with his limitations that he'd never considered how strong he could be, how much he was missing. That line of thought could be dangerous for him, though. He knew the coin gave him more than what was humanly possible, though. Anyone would probably feel weak after that amount of strength. Still, it shook him. He had to be mindful, only use the magic when he absolutely needed it. Lex lifted the chain over his head and tucked it into the saddlebag. He didn't need it now. What he needed was to get far away from Galanus before anyone woke to find him missing. If he rode through the night and into the day, he should be able to lose anyone looking for him. What would his parents think of him running away? "I'm not running away," he thought. "I'm running to something. Someone." With a great deal of effort, Lex mounted his horse and patted her neck. "All right, Pep. If there's a girl out there for me, let's pray the gods lead us to find her." He kicked her flanks and disappeared into the forest. The next page contains a note which was probably written by Lex about the various items that he would need to make his escape, some attempts at poetry down here, and so on. I'm not going to read the whole note to you. Instead, I will move on. Epigraph. This has been my most difficult struggle, helping people who begin to feel I owe them something. Chapter 3. Karina. Karina paused, her hands suddenly cold, and she balled them into fists to get her blood moving again. With a deep breath, she nodded to the servants, and the heavy doors opened before her. She strode through the arched doorway onto the portico. Cool night air wrapped around her face and bare arms. causing bumps of chill to rise all over her. She took a small moment to revel in the view. Her family's palace sat on a small hill, overlooking the central fields of Regania, the wild forests, and the looming mountains beyond. Below the palace were homes of lower lords, knights, and peasants who lived under the protection, or lack thereof, of Karina's father, High Lord Maximus Valio. The thought of him brought her back to herself, and she blinked before looking to him. He stood in the center of the space, staring down at the fire pit, with his back to her. His shoulders were tense, and his jaw stiff. He wore the same style chiton as she, belted at the waist and hanging to the floor, but his was deep blue and hers scarlet. The colors fit them, he being slightly lighter in complexion, though still the olive-skinned tone of most Reganians. But Karina displayed the deep brown skin of her Medallian mother. Karina shifted slightly, her sandals scratching at the stone floor. The silence made her heart race. "Karina," he said. She gasped, but thankfully kept it inaudible. "Yes, father?" The tension in his body eased away as he sighed. "I am only relieved to hear your voice, child. I am glad that you chose to dine with me tonight instead of in your room." She swallowed. "Why is that?" "We should hear word on the proposal this evening. I have high hopes, and have ordered a fine feast in your honor." Karina paled, grateful he couldn't see. She'd nearly forgotten about the proposal. The palace was only a 12-hour ride away on a fast horse in good weather, so they ought to hear the same day a decision was made. She thought of Prince Alexander. She didn't know him well. They had only spoken once or twice, had an official outing together that was supposedly her audition, at least that's how she thought of it, to be his wife. He'd always seemed nice enough, but she felt no desire to be attached to him. It was all her father's idea. "I am certain you shall live a happy life at the side of our dear prince," he said, a slight hint of bitterness in his tone. No one else would have caught it, but Karina knew it well. From a door to her right, servants began carrying in platters of fruits, breads, and cheeses. Karina joined her father at a long table set up on the far side of the fire pit, overlooking the small city of Velios, and beyond, the fields and moors that made up central Regania. Karina ate quickly. Something about her father's presence told her she didn't have time for a leisurely meal. Aside from the rare clink of silverware against plate, there was only silence. They never prayed over their food, especially not since Mother died. Karina had never been especially faithful on her own, but she'd always worshipped with Mother. When she died, Father continued to take Karina to services, but his heart was never in it. She'd tried to speak to him about it, but those times had not ended well. Halfway through their soup, a rich blend of tomatoes, marjoram, and fish, a servant entered. She curtsied low. "My lord, Sir Zyvan is here for you. Shall I have him wait?" Karina froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Father didn't notice, only wiped his mouth gingerly. No, send him in." The door opened wider, and a tall, thick man strode through. Zyvan was her father's personal servant, a Calidian man who had sworn himself to Lord Valio. Karina looked up once to take in his appearance. Black trousers under a short black riding robe, with silver buckles. One piercing brown eye, the other covered with a patch. His skin was slightly darker than her own, his hair a stunning blue. He had worked for her father for nearly 5 years, since right after Mother died. She didn't know much about him, and she didn't want to. "Master," Zyvan said, his deep voice resonating even in the open space, "I wish I had better news. It has been confirmed today. The prince went missing yesterday." Karina's eyes widened, staring at her soup. Her father stood slowly, calmly. "What do you mean?" "Rumors say he ran away, master," Zyvan said. "His quarters were found empty, a rope hanging from the pillars of his room. The king's best hunters were sent to find him." Father began to pace, one hand running through his golden hair. "The boy is smart, capable. He'll have gone as far as possible to avoid being caught. He paused, looking at Ivan. Can you find him? Of course, master. Do it then, before the king's guard do, and bring him here. Yes, master. Ivan bowed, then turned to go. Karina stole a glance as he left, part of her wishing to be dismissed as quickly. Leave us, her father said. Karina rose. A moment later, all servants and staff had fled the room. She took 2 deep breaths. Her father's hand gripped her arm and hauled her from her chair. After everything I've planned, he growled, low enough that his voice would not be heard through the doors. Everything I've worked for, the prince runs away at the very thought of marrying you. She tried to plead, but only whimpers escaped her. He threw her to the ground, her shoulders scraping against the stone floor, pain shooting through her arm. Her head was so close to the fire pit that she could feel the heat on her cheek. A moment later, his sandaled foot slammed into her ribs. The breath was knocked from her, and she gulped at the air to refill her lungs. But another kick followed, making her slide away from the heat. She retreated, curling in on herself, trying to let the pain be a thing she observed rather than felt. You have the best education money can buy, he said. You've been trained in arts young women only dream of, had the best stylists in the kingdom design your very appearance, yet you are still not good enough. Karina choked as air returned to her, letting her head rest on the cool floor. All she saw was her father's feet and lower legs. The rest of her vision was a blur. She screamed as he landed one last kick, this time to her lower abdomen, perhaps in an effort to assure he received no grandchildren. The thought didn't upset her nearly as much as it probably should have. He stepped lightly around the fire pit. Karina closed her eyes, sucking in air, listening. I'm so tired of living under these soft-hearted, slow-thinking monarchs, he muttered, more to himself than her, she knew. Stefan and Larissa don't deserve the crowns they wear, and that brat Alexander only shows his ineptitude by running when he ought to be forming alliances. Stupid imbeciles. She'd heard all this before. She'd known his intentions were to wed her to the prince, then run the kingdom from behind the throne. She'd gone along with it, hadn't had a choice to do otherwise. Still, as she lay on the cold marble, forcing air into her lungs, she wondered whether she had been the reason for the prince's escape. He didn't seem like the kind to leave her without an answer, but perhaps she'd misread him. I have spent nearly all our resources getting the loyalty of the church, the king's guard, even the mucking lower lords here are with me. If only I can get control. She opened her eyes, staring at the flames licking up into the cool summer air. Her father still muttered, circling the fire pit, his sharp features made sharper by the shadows and flickering before him. He looked like Karina used to imagine a virus, those vessels who channeled the power of death and shadows. She'd never met one and didn't want to, but that couldn't stop a child's imagination from inventing things. Another knock sounded, and the same servant entered. She did not spare a glance for the crumpled daughter on the floor, and Karina was glad of it. It would only make things worse. My lord, the local high cure is here to see you. One moment, father said. Without explanation, he lifted Karina from the floor like a doll and placed her in her seat. She forced herself to sit straight as he arranged the folds of her dress and laid her hair over one shoulder to hide the scrape she'd just received. Lovely as always, my dear. Karina shivered. The High Cure was the head of the church's local branch over the life vessels. Karina had met the man a few times, but doubted he'd noticed her. Midnight blue robes trailed after him. A silver line ran down each sleeve to mark his position in the church's hierarchy. Good evening, Lord Valio. Good evening indeed, Father. Karina's father was now the epitome of piousness. To what do I owe the pleasure of your company? The vessel smiled. I wished to thank you in person for the generous donation you sent last week. Because of the faith and charity of people like you, this kingdom might continue to prosper. Might, you say? Father asked. Regania is a strong and self-sufficient kingdom. Is there any doubt? The vessel sighed. Rather dramatically, Karina thought. It is only this ordeal with the prince, my lord. The man looked from side to side, as though checking for eavesdroppers. The royal family has chosen no heir in the event that the prince does not return. Bellio frowned, leaning forward. Do you mean to imply that he may not return? There was rumor of a note saying he would, but no proof. The church in particular is in an awkward position. We speak for the gods, and we support the crown, but we cannot support an heir who is not acting as one. Bellio rubbed a hand over his trimmed beard. Will the monarchs choose a second heir? Doubtful, my lord, though they are being encouraged to do so. Bellio nodded. Then let us pray they will choose the person best suited for it. Or that the prince will return safely, the vessel added. Of course, yes. Thank you, father. The vessel bowed and left the room. Karina did not move. She did not eat, nor barely breathe. Her father continued to circle the fire pit, eyes narrowed, muttering under his breath. She caught words such as prince and heir, and she couldn't have heard kill? No, her father would never. Would he? She shoved her fear aside and tried to listen more carefully. Karina, her father said in his full voice. She jumped in her chair, but stood shakily. Yes, father? Go see if Zyvan has left yet. If he has not, send him to me. I have more instructions for him. Yes, father, she said, curtsying. And describe. I need to act quickly. Of course, father. For some nobility, being sent on an errand like this would be embarrassing, but Karina was through the doors in the space of a heartbeat. Karina always did as she was told, but she could imagine otherwise when no one was watching. Her bedroom was fully enclosed on the northeastern corner of the Bellio Palace. It had windows, but at the moment they were covered by heavy curtains. Her doors to the main colonnade and to her baths were closed and locked. She sat on the carpeted floor before a modest fireplace, wearing nothing but her underclothes, linen shorts and a wrap around her torso. She breathed deeply of Fugaran incense she'd lit before her. It wasn't as energizing as her scented oils, but it would do until she could distill more. Her shoulders fought to droop, but she forced them straight. After leaving her father, she had indeed found Zyvan preparing to leave, and sent him back as he was about to mount his horse. She'd then come straight to her room to apply Dr. Bush oil to her scrape and bruises. She was nearly out, and would need to send for more of the flowers from the southern Reganian territories. There was no cure serving at the Bellio Palace, only Karina and her oils. And she was not about to go out into the city to find treatment. That would mean admitting what was happening. She was certain all the servants knew. She closed her eyes, focusing on her breath. After Mother's death, Father had changed. He'd never been particularly compassionate before, but it seemed sometimes as though she were living with an entirely different person. He shut her out and found release with his mistresses. The poor girls, not much older than Karina, who he closeted away for a few months at a time and then threw into the streets when they were too weak to function. Karina felt for them. They were harmed far more than she, and in far worse ways. She was sometimes able to slip poison to them in case they wanted an easier way out. She knew that feeling, too. The place where dignity no longer mattered and worth was a thing of the past. She shook those thoughts from her head. For the moment, she needed to close her eyes and clear her mind. She thought of the color of her hair, deep Medilian black, with thick streaks of Reganian gold. Something in the Medilian blood caused it to mix with others in this certain way, and Karina could never decide if she was proud of it or embarrassed. It certainly made her stand out in the Reganian court, which was not always what she wanted, but imagining the smooth texture and dramatic coloring helped her calm herself and slow her heart. She stood, pushing the incense toward the fireplace, and went to her wardrobe. Everything was in its place. She could easily have done this blindfolded. She removed her sword from its spot beneath her training armor and drew it from the sheath. The handle was a deep gray steel wrapped in black leather, embedded with a small ruby at the pommel, a gift from her mother on her 10th birthday. She'd outgrown it after Mother died, and thankfully Father had it reforged using the same materials and design. It was made for her. Fit her better than any other sword ever had. But there had always been something off about handling it. Like it could be slightly better and was missing something. She went back to the open space before her fire and took up a practice stance. Her feet stable on a thick, soft carpet, she raised the blade before her and began to move. Slowly at first, then with more speed as she finished the dance and began again without pause. Her muscles began to burn, sweat trickled from her hairline. Her thin clothing stuck to her the more she worked. When she danced, her mind was clearer than any other time. She went over everything she'd heard at dinner. The prince, her father, Zyvan. How was it all connected? Dare she even continue this line of thought? 3 times through the dance, and then she stopped abruptly, holding the sword before her as she had when beginning. She held that stance, her muscles burning, until her heart had again slowed. Then finally released her sore and tired muscles. Sword back in sheath, sheath back in wardrobe. Karina closed the doors and rested her forehead against the wood. Nearly half an hour had passed, and she still felt unsettled. A knock sounded at the door to her baths. My lady? Adia, her handmaid. Yes, I'm here, Karina called. Shall I draw your bath up now? Yes, please, and thank you, Adia. My pleasure, lady. Karina went toward the doors and paused before opening them. Something warm tickled her cheek, and she wiped it away. A tear. How odd. She never cried any more when her father hit her, and rarely at any other time. She couldn't remember the last tear to fall from her eyes. She stared at her fingertips, the tear smeared across them. She couldn't stop her father. She knew that. Not that she would be brave enough to try. And there we reach the end of Chapter 3 of Target by Darci Cole. For a little bit more info about the author, Darci Cole is an author, narrator, and podcaster in the fantasy genre. She and her husband run Colavanders, a wand shop catering to lovers of magic and cosplay. She loves Harry Potter, oracle cards, pretty dice, and supernatural. While she spends most of her time wrangling children, she also enjoys beta reading for her friends and acclaimed authors. Darci currently lives in Arizona with her husband and 4 children. Darci has many social media accounts that you can follow. Links to all of those will be in a link tree in the description of this video. She has Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, TikTok, YouTube, a podcast, a newsletter on her website, darcicole.com, a Patreon, and more. If you would like to read the rest of this book, information to purchase the book will also be in the description. I really liked those first 3 chapters of Target, and I'm really interested, especially in Karina as a character. It seems she's in an absolutely horrible position with her father, and I am very interested to see how she overcomes these challenges and to see the outlaws that were mentioned in the cover blurb and Lex meeting them. And I think I will greatly enjoy reading through the rest of Target by Darci Cole, and I hope you've enjoyed your look at the first chapters of the book.